and kick it off. Let me start the recording. Hi, everybody, and welcome to our September edition of our Green Thumb Lecture Series. If this is your first one, just a quick intro. This is a free monthly gardening series that we've been giving for years. Every month we do one class on a wide range of usually gardening or backyard production related classes. They really range all over the place. We use y'all's feedback from our surveys and our evaluations to sort of decide when we plan each year what topics we're going to do, or just maybe input from the community as we go. So I'm going to use that to plug right now. If you got your reminder email, it has a link for an evaluation there at the bottom. There's also, we'll send a follow-up email with a little bit of information and the slide presentation if you want that, and we'll send the link again just so you don't have an excuse. But if you would take a few minutes to fill out that evaluation after this evening, it really helps us in sort of honing our presentations and making them catered to what you guys want to see. So just a little bit of instruction is how we're going to carry out the presentation and the questions on the virtual format. What we like to do is I will be sort of moderating all of the questions in the chat box. So probably by this point, most of y'all are familiar with using a chat box. But if you guys want to go ahead and just sort of get us warmed up and make sure everybody can find the chat box down at the bottom of your screen, this is how we'll do questions and interactions during and after the presentation. But everybody just kind of say what's up and let us know where you're joining us from. We always kind of like to know. Sometimes we have mostly local. Every once in a while we have a few out-of-state people, but it's kind of nice to see where people are coming from. Yeah, awesome, thanks. So we'll do that, and then similarly, I'm going to be keeping track of all the questions as you guys ask them. I know it's hard to remember all your questions to the end, so feel free to throw your questions in the chat box throughout the whole thing, and if I'm able to, if it's sort of appropriate and we have time, I can ask Dan some of those questions as we go, and any of them that I don't get to during the presentation, don't worry, hopefully I have them written down and we'll ask them at the end. So just because I didn't address your question, it may just be a timing thing, but we'll get to it at the end, and I'll let everybody ask any follow-up questions at the end as well. So I think that's mostly it, and we'll just go ahead and I'm going to turn it over to Dan. I'm sure some of y'all are already familiar with Dan Long who are joining us. If you're new to Athens or the sort of beekeeping world, and that's why you're joining us here, Dan is the president of the Eastern Piedmont Beekeepers Association that meets here in Athens. We normally have master gardeners. Most of our Green Thumb lecture series are hosted by knowledgeable master gardeners, but every once in a while we get a guest host sort of from the outside world. And Dan agreed to come and speak with us tonight. So welcome, Dan, and we stop sharing, so whenever you're ready.
Okay, hi, thanks everybody. Thanks for inviting me to speak tonight. Laura, my screen share has been disabled. If you could maybe make me co-host, then I'll be able to do that. Hey, as long as we have a second here, if you all could do the same thing how you said where you're from, if you could indicate maybe a new beekeeper or not beekeeping yet or something like that. I see a Sheen Snellgrove here. Hi. Did you know there's a famous beekeeper by the last name of Snellgrove? Lewis Snellgrove, maybe? I can't remember. But he developed a very specific beekeeping piece of equipment that people like to use. Okay, so some not yet interested. Good. This is perfect. This is really good. This is just the kind of, okay, good. I can share my screen now. Terrific. And let's go ahead and do the presentation. Okay, great. We're off and running here. So yeah, this is a very basic beginner presentation here designed for people interested in beekeeping, maybe those who are doing it already but just getting started this year and really feel like they need some more information. You know, beekeeping is really, it's a wonderful, fun hobby. It's a great way to get into the outdoors, get a little bit back to nature, so to speak. And I encourage everyone to try to get your kids involved as well, get them properly protected and out there with the bees, get them off the screen all the time. Of course, you know, gets me off the screen a lot too when I'm keeping bees. Some of the usefulness of having bees in your backyard, not just getting yourself out there, but they can provide pollination service for a small farm or a neighborhood or even a backyard garden. They're very good for pollinating various fruit trees and blueberries and some of the vegetable crops that we have as well. And of course, there's always honey. The average, say, if you have just a couple of hives in your backyard that are thriving, you could get, let's just say, 60 pounds of honey a year from that. That's a lot to share for your friends and family and yourself, and you can even make a little bit of money on the side. One of the things I really like about beekeeping as a hobby is it's one of those that can actually pay for itself pretty readily. And there are other products from the hive, primarily beeswax, that are available as a result of harvesting your honey, which is useful for a lot of things. I have a couple of woodworkers that I barter because they use the wax in their wood finishes on their various turned bowls and other things. And then there are various salves and balms and whatnot. I like to make lip balm, fresh, natural lip balm every year out of some of my wax. So as I mentioned, there's a lot to learn about beekeeping. I want to stress that this is just an introduction. I don't want y'all to run out right after this lecture and start buying stuff online. It takes a lot of learning. What we're going to talk about tonight, we're going to cover a lot of ground. I'll try to move at a reasonable pace, and I will be available until whenever you need to answer all questions you have at the end of the program, or in the middle if you need to. But there is a whole lot to learn about beekeeping. Really, it takes some patience and it can be a little frustrating, but once you get into it and understand it, it can be a really, really wonderful and rewarding hobby. The next question is where? You know, a lot of people think, well, maybe I can't keep bees because I only have a quarter of an acre, or I don't own my own land or property or anything like that. But you'd be surprised. I've got a fellow by email dying to have somebody put hives in his backyard, and we're going to try to match him up with somebody who is dying to beekeep but doesn't feel as though they can do it at their property. It does not take a whole lot of land. This right here, this is 6 hives that I keep on somebody else's property right now, and it takes up about 100 square feet. Some of the important factors in locating your hives will be safety. Primarily, you don't want there to be a lot of activity immediately in front of the entrance of the hives. You want to have a good 10, 15 feet of buffer there. You want to be thinking about whether or not you've got kids in the backyard that are going to play, maybe kick a soccer ball into it and disturb the hive. Whether or not you have pets, that it might be a problem for them. Although I will say, for the most part, I have dogs and cats and chickens that free range. They all just know to avoid the beehive. It's instinct for them. There are several other considerations. There are specifically laws in the state of Georgia protecting beekeeping to say that you cannot prohibit beekeeping, but there are restrictions placed at various levels. I saw earlier there are people from all over the state here. If you're in a typical rural location, you shouldn't have any trouble at all. There are even zoning areas in downtown Athens. I'm going to read a little list here. If your zoning is AR, CR, RS40, and RS25, you can have beehives on your property. Now, if you're not in that zoning, my understanding from the compliance people is that it is enforcement by complaint, which means if your neighbors don't say anything, then you don't have anything to worry about. And if nobody complains about the bees being there, then they're just going to let that be. The last consideration would be if you have a homeowners association, they do take precedent over all other laws when it comes to beekeeping. And that can be a tricky situation there. If you're in an HOA neighborhood, look carefully at the association bylaws before deciding to place hives on your property. How much is it going to cost to be a beekeeper? Well, there is a fair amount of equipment. The hives themselves, the boxes, it's a significant amount of cabinetry, so to speak, and there are various tools involved. I believe this starter kit here retails for about $300, and that does not include the bees. And also, really, most beekeepers you talk to are going to tell you to start with 2 hives. The reason for that is that if one of the hives is in trouble, you can actually use resources, including bees and brood with the larvae and pupae of the colony. You can transfer them back and forth to help boost up a colony that's not doing so well. Do you need all this stuff shown in this kit? This kit's not overboard. It's pretty accurate what you're going to need. You've got a veil and a smoker and gloves on top of the hive. You've got a basic hive setup, and we'll talk more about that, with an inner cover and what's called a queen excluder, a brush, a hive tool. That book shown right there, First Lessons in Beekeeping, is by a local expert, Dr. Keith Delaplane. I highly recommend that book, The First Lessons in Beekeeping. There's a lot of information out there, a lot of different books now, a lot of YouTube videos. That book has the real deal and the right information. On the left is smoker fuel in this kit. Really honestly, around here, pine straw makes really great smoker fuel, and you don't need to buy fuel as long as you can get under a pine tree. How much time is it going to take? This is one of the beauties and terrors of beekeeping, is that it only takes about 75 hours a year for a small backyard apiary. The reason that's bad is because unlike your dog or your cat that you have to attend to every day, it's very easy to let the bees slide because they provide their own food most of the year, or they don't need daily care most of the year. It's easy to let slide, and they are livestock. They're small stinging livestock, but still livestock. They will need care in order to thrive. So count on 75 hours a year. And then there's this. I'm willing to face 50,000 stinging insects tear open their home and steal their food on a regular basis? Well, if you are, then you've picked the right time to start your journey. This is a great time right now. You can take the information that you'll learn tonight, you can learn some more shortly after, and really begin the process this fall and winter. What you're going to do is you're going to source bees. It's the very first step. So I recommend around November or December, you actually order your bees. And it sounds a little bit crazy because you think in terms of springtime, but supplies are often very short in the spring, and it's really best to order your bees early. You're not going to get them until the spring, but you'll get on the list with the more reputable bee suppliers. What you see here, this is a package, and this is basically 3 pounds, about 10,000 bees, mostly workers. Inside this cage, there's another little cage with a queen in it, and also a feeder jar. And this package here you can pick up locally from various sources, but oftentimes these things are actually shipped through the mail. I can tell you the postal carriers don't love it, but they deliver it. What I'm going to recommend instead for most beekeepers is to start with a nucleus colony, or what we call a nuke. And that's that plastic tub that you see down there. It's actually a specialty tub, not just a regular Rubbermaid, that holds 5 frames. In those 5 frames, you have basically a complete mini colony ready to go. It has a queen, it has some honey storage, it has pollen. It is an active colony as opposed to just a big old pile of bees and a queen. It's going to have brood, the young bees, the larvae and pupae. It's going to have some honey storage, pollen, and they're already cohesive. They know their queen, they know her by scent. It's a pheromone thing, and it is a really great way. You're going to pay more. You'll pay maybe 100 to 110 for a package. You're going to pay, usually these days at minimum, $150 for a nuke, but it's really worthwhile to start that way. And that's something that can't be shipped to you, but there are various suppliers all over the state of Georgia that will supply nucleus colonies. All right, let's talk about hive components. Let's say you've ordered up your bees, and then the next step in that is going to be to order or build your hive components here. This is what's known as a traditional or Langstroth hive. It's the most common kind of hive that you can get in the United States. And it has, as I mentioned before, it's a bit of cabinetry with a lot of components. And it looks complicated, but in fact, it's actually pretty straightforward in that it is very modular. All these components stack up on each other and break back down again. And through various times of the season, you're going to use more or fewer of these boxes. What you can see at the very top, let's just start at the top real quick. You have telescoping outer cover. It is only called telescoping because it goes over and around the top lid. It has a lip on it so the whole thing rests over and keeps everything else dry. Don't know why they chose telescoping, but that's what we all call them. The inner cover is a fairly important piece of equipment that the honeybees are going to glue everything together with the resin we call propolis. And it can be very difficult to remove the telescoping cover unless you have the inner cover in place. It is helpful to have. The shallow super meaning above, and the shallow and the medium depth super are basically just 2 different sizes. These are typically used as your honey boxes. So you're going to have down at the very bottom there, you're going to have standard brood box. That's where they're going to make the nest. And you see just above that, the queen excluder that keeps the queen from going up and laying eggs up in where you want to harvest honey, because you really want to try hard not to mix brood with honey. And then to bottom it all off there, you've got the screen bottom board. The hive stand is completely optional. You can just set them up on a couple of concrete blocks. It's best not to put them right on the ground. You can buy all kinds of expensive stands or just, like I said, go with some blocks or some wood. I'll show you a few examples of the way I have them set up here in a bit. Inside all of those boxes are the frames, and on those frames you put foundation, or you let them build naturally, and then they will build out their honeycomb from that. They actually exude wax from glands on their abdomens and chew it up and shape it to form the honeycomb. So Langstroth is very popular, very common, and unfortunately, to complicate things further, it's offered in various widths as well. These are deep boxes here. On the bottom, that box holds 10 frames. The next one up holds 8, and the one on the top holds 5. There are a few people who work with just 5 frame, but typically that is used to build nucleus colonies, the nukes. The 8 frame in the middle there is nicer and is becoming more popular because it's lighter than the 10 frame on the bottom. 10 frame is a traditional full-sized Langstroth hive. The 8 frame is a good bit lighter, especially if you're filling up supers with honey. They can be pretty heavy and unwieldy to deal with. So I recommend if people are going to go with this style of hive that they start with and stick with 8-frame equipment. That's what I use. Another style of hive that's completely different and gaining in popularity now is called the top bar hive. These are sometimes referred to as Kenyan, and then there's another similar style called Tanzanian top bar hives. They're much simpler to construct and a little bit easier to handle in some ways, but harder in others. Basically, they take just the top rail of a frame and rest them all in a row along the top of this and let the bees build all natural comb out of them. And in operation, you lift this lid, they're often hinged, and then you just lift out one frame at a time. This is really good if you have a hard time moving heavy objects for whatever reason. I've got a buddy who's been beekeeping for 30 years now, and he's got back trouble, and he is ready to switch over to something more like this. The downside is you have to be much more careful with the comb because they don't have a full frame around them. An interesting, really new hybrid version of all of that, I guess it's really new to me. It's been around for a few years. This is called a horizontal hive or a long Langstroth. And it takes the frame that we use in the Langstroth hive, so it's a standard frame, and it runs horizontally like a top bar hive. So it's a hybrid between the two. And I've just started working with them, and I have to say it's really nice. Again, you're only lifting one frame at a time. Once you place this hive, there's nothing else you have to lift heavy. I think the lid is actually heavier than is the heaviest thing to lift in this. It's very good for folks who don't want to lift heavy objects. But the bees seem to like it too. Okay, you're going to need some other equipment too. I guess you saw from that kit there. On the left is a bee brush. You don't need that as often as you might think. It bothers the bees to be brushed. They don't really enjoy it, but there are times when you're going to want it, so it's good to have. The second one from the left there is your hive tool. It's basically a small pry bar, and it is absolutely essential. And there are dozens of different styles of hive tools. My personal favorite is the Italian hive tool, but everybody's got their own, so I'm not gonna go into details on that too much, except to say if you stay in beekeeping long enough, you're gonna end up with a collection of hive tools until you find the one that's just right for you. On the bottom right, that red object there, I don't know why that often comes with beginner kits. It is what's called a capping scratcher. It's a harvest tool, and we'll talk about harvest later. The big important one up there on the top right is your smoker. And again, you're going to use some kind of a dry fuel. Some people use cardboard or untreated burlap. But again, here in Georgia, pine straw is readily available. It is essential to keep it dry if you're going to get it lit. And there are lots and lots of techniques and plenty of YouTube videos on how to light and how to keep it lit and how to source your fuel and all kinds of good stuff. Last important piece of equipment is going to be whatever kind of safety equipment that you want. There are a lot of beekeepers in the United States who kind of cowboy the whole thing. They don't wear anything at all. Sometimes they'll just wear a veil. And it's true, some days I just wear a veil. If I'm just going to do a light inspection and it's really good weather and the bees are all going to be calm, I may wear very little because it gets hot in Georgia, even in a suit. Now this is a ventilated suit here. It has a mesh that is really wide open and very comfortable. This particular one is called the Pro Vent. If there's any kind of breeze at all, it's very nice. And what it is just the mesh material is slightly thicker than the length of a honeybee stinger. So if they try to sting you through it, they just can't get through. You may choose to just get a veil and go with a long sleeve shirt. A lot of times I am barehanded when I'm beekeeping because there's better sensitivity, and sometimes I'm doing things like I'm I'm putting a queen in a cage or something like that. Something, typically speaking, in your kits, you're going to get a heavy, thick leather glove. You're kind of pawing at your bees at that point, and you're going to smash more bees, and it's going to make them angrier. What I really like as a compromise to that, if you want to wear some sort of gloves, is get a thick nitrile glove. And yes, they can sting you through that, but they tend not to for the most part. And when they do, you can just flick it. Another recommendation is absolutely positively join a beekeeping club. You're going to meet people with lots and lots of experience. You're going to get tips. You're going to possibly get good deals on buying your bees. I know at Eastern Piedmont, we typically have a group buy every winter. And one of the club members will drive down to the bottom of Georgia and pick up nukes, and they're a good price, and they've typically been pretty good nukes. And Oglethorpe County Bee Club, actually, well, gosh, you guys are from all over the state. I should really recommend check out the listings at the Georgia Beekeepers Association. We have, I want to say we have 43 or 44 clubs, and they are all over the state. And joining a local club is really beneficial. Lots and lots of good advice. You can often find someone who's willing to come out and help you with your bees, or willing to have you over and take you through their bees on an inspection, because seeing all of this in person is going to beat my presentation, any YouTube video, anything else like that. Actually getting into a hive, seeing that, actually picking up a frame of bees and looking it over and doing the whole thing for real is really going to help you. It'll help you make that decision, and it'll instantly make you a better beekeeper. And of course, when it's not a global pandemic, taking classes is a great idea. Unfortunately, a lot of that has been shut down for right now. That may change possibly by next spring. I certainly hope so. We had a whole program at Eastern Piedmont ready to go for new beekeepers, and had to shut it down. Again, same idea as going over to somebody's bee yard. You actually get into the hives, you see what's going on for real. You get to practice with a hive tool and a smoker. Hands-on experience is really important and very helpful. I should say something here. I wasn't going to, but that smoker makes it look as though they're really gassing out the bees. And the use of the smoker should be sparing as possible. You're not trying to gas them out. You're trying to distract them. The photograph was taken at exactly the right moment. I think this is likely the first time this gal was using a smoker. So it looks really heavy duty. A puff here and there is what you really want to do. You're interrupting their sensory inputs and also distracting them into thinking there might be a fire somewhere nearby. You're not attempting to gas them out. Okay, so you've ordered your bees. You know about when they're coming. You've gotten your equipment, your protective gear. One of the things I would really stress strongly before you get your bees is to practice with your smoker. Everybody can use a hive tool right off the bat. They know how to do that. Everybody knows how to put gloves on and a veil and all that sort of thing. But the smoker can be tricky to get lit and keep because of the way it's designed, unfortunately. It probably hasn't changed in 100 years. But I really strongly recommend some afternoon, you're hanging out on your patio, you've got some pine straw, play around with the smoker a little bit. Puff it a few times, get it going, set it down on the table, fiddle around with something else, crack open a cold beverage, come back, puff it a little bit more. See how it operates, see how yours operates, because they're all just a little bit different, just slightly different. They're different sizes and some different slight style changes. And just get a hand on it, figure it out, try it a few times. You're going to find you're a lot less frustrated if you try to do your first inspection on your own and you have never lit your smoker. Okay, so the time comes and your beekeeping supplier calls you or emails you and tells you, come get your bees or your bees have shipped. So you've got to be ready to go. They typically try, if you're going to be picking them up or if they're going to ship them, they try to give you a fairly accurate date. But this is an agricultural endeavor here, and the weather can play a big factor in when your bees are going to be ready. There could be a 2-week spread. And there could be really bad weather causing significant delays, and you might even, unfortunately, now and then have a cancellation. This is a beekeeper up in Toccoa who was selling a whole bunch of packages that year right out of their garage. And yes, you go to pick it up, you're going to drive home with 10,000 stinging insects in your car. So drive carefully. Put that seatbelt on that box. And then you're going to have your equipment all ready and you're going to install your bees. This is my daughter Sophia with her top bar hive, and we're installing a package. One of the things about the top bar hive, because of the shape of it and the fact that you don't have full frames, you cannot buy a nuke for a top bar. You can buy a nuke for Langstroth, and you can buy one for the horizontal hive, that what we call the long line. But you pretty much have to get a package for a top bar. I know of one place in Georgia that makes top bar nukes, but it's a small operation and it's not readily available for most people. So what you're going to do is you're going to follow the instructions that hopefully your package supplier has given you, which is to pry off the lid, take out the feeder jar, take out the queen, and if you look at the bottom of this slide, you'll see a little red clip. The queen has a little ribbon sticking on her cage. I'll show you her cage in a second. And you're going to hang her down in there. And the reason is they're going to smell her. They're going to head in that direction, and you can actually watch them. You can shake them in. I'll show you real quick here. There's the queen cage right there. And if you see at the top of my other glove there, you can see that plastic ribbon. You just clip that or staple that onto a bar or a frame and hang her down in there. They will gravitate towards her. This is what she looks like right here. She looks very much like all the workers that are surrounding her, but she has a longer abdomen and, typically speaking, a little less variation in color on the abdomen, and also a large shiny thorax, that big dark gray shield there you see on her back. So you can shake the bees in. There are lots and lots and lots of techniques for doing this where people say, oh, you can't shake your bees and you shouldn't do this and that. Perfectly fine. People have been doing it for 100 years, shaking packages. There's more that you can buy. That you can have specialty funnels that are designed to go with packages that will help them to find their way in more gently. You really don't need to worry about it. If the package is strong and healthy, they'll be fine shaking them in. And then you just leave the remainder of them outside, and they will smell and locate the colony right there, and they'll literally crawl and or fly into the hive for you. See, here they are crawling all over. When you get a package, you can see down in between these frames here, there's a glass mason jar. And we'll talk about feeding more in a bit. When you get a package, even if you're in the spring nectar flow in the April-May time period, it's really a good idea to give them some feed anyway. They may have been in that package for a while. They may not be accessing the feed jar properly. Go ahead and give them some feed. If they don't need it, they won't take it, and you can remove it on first inspection, but it's handy to have for them. Here is the nucleus hive again, the nuke, which is what I recommend for most people. What you're going to do is you're going to set that down gently, let it rest for a minute, then take off the lid and smoke it a little bit, and one by one, take those frames and put them into the hive, which is there on the left, with an empty one on the outside, maybe more, depending on the width of hive you're working with, and put them in the same order and orientation that they came. And that helps them. It's not absolutely essential, But remember, they've got a home in there. They've got a cohesive nesting going on in there already. If you stagger that, you can change their behavior a little bit. The less you change when installing this, the better. Typically speaking, they've got a decent amount of honey storage with them already, and you don't need to feed them. You can if you want, but it's typically not necessary at all. And this is what a decent looking frame looks like. In the center here, those sort of yellow cappings there, that is all the brood. And if you look all the way on the right, not all the way, but just past the capped brood, you can see what's open brood. Those are the larvae right there. All the capped brood, they are now pupating, and they will emerge as adult bees. If you see at the very top, up against the top bar of this frame, you'll see that's all honey storage in that arc up at the very top. In between those, the multicolored area there on the left is actually what we call bee bread. It's primarily pollen, and that is there to be ready for the nurse bees to consume so that they will have what they need to feed the larvae, which they actually exude out of glands from their body. I'm going to try and see if this is going to play for you. I'm here on 2 rusty old copper wires, and my transmission rate's pretty bad, but we'll see if this plays for you. What I want to say is, after you put them in, after you first install them, just let them be. Let them go for a week. You can come over and watch them. Take a look if you want to, but don't disturb them otherwise. Let them settle into their new home. Yeah, that video played okay. I hope it played all right for you.
Dan, just quick question in here. About how long does an individual bee live? Is it a seasonal thing, or do they live multiple years?
That's a good question. There are 2 different genders, and within one gender, 2 different castes. So let's talk about first the male bees. They will live for up to a couple of months, unless they are successful at mating with a queen, in which case they die. They actually die as part of the act of mating with the queen. It is terminal for them. So also, if they're kicking around at the end of the season, hanging out in the hive, the workers will literally boot them from the hive. They will not let them remain in the hive in the winter because they're just a drain on resources. We can talk more about drones and bee sex later if there's time. Then the typical worker bee, this is every single one of the bees in this picture is a worker bee. There are no drones in this picture that I can see. The drones have larger eyes and fat bottoms. The larger eyes are to be able to see the queens out there to mate with them. They mate on the wing out in what are called drone congregation areas. But I digress. Worker bees will live across the span of weeks, like 6 or 7 weeks as adults in the spring and summer season. They literally work themselves to death for the sake of the colony. They just work and work and work and work. At the end of the summer, and as temperatures start to get colder, bees are raised that are able to live through the entire winter. So those bees can live up to 6 months. A queen bee, a special female, can live technically up to 5 years. Typically speaking, these days it seems as though there are more problems, and queens are living typically 1 to 3 years. The first year queens tend to be the most productive. Okay.
Yeah, that was a much more interesting answer than I thought it was going to be.
Well, it's, like I said, beekeeping is complicated. There are a lot of details to cover, and I don't want to try to cover them all here tonight. But it's often helpful just if people have questions, by all means, for what is commonly understood for beekeepers might not be clear to somebody just getting going. So I'm happy to answer questions. I do recommend keeping your beekeeping tools organized. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. You know, a lot of people just use a 5-gallon bucket. What I have found is I made this little tote here that holds all the basic stuff. I have actually 4 totes now because I do a lot of different things. I raise queens. I use one for treatments. I use one for a thing called beelining. But this is the basic toolkit right here, all gathered together, easy access. Everything's handy when you need it. So I keep that with my bee suit and my veil. So after a week or maybe a little bit more, you don't have to hurry into this. Let them get settled in. You're going to want to do an inspection. So you're going to light up your smoker, make sure you've got that running. You're good at it now because you've done it a bunch of times over the course of the winter and early spring. Then you're going to gently pop open the lid on your hive after you've smoked your bees. You smoke a little at the entrance. When you crack the lid, you can smoke a little bit under the lid. Then you're going to open up the inner cover. We showed all those parts earlier. And you're going to gently pry. And the reason I say pry is because after a very short time, those bees are going to glue all these parts together with that resin we call propolis. So, you know, people think that bees only gather nectar and pollen, but they actually gather a wide range of things, including water in the summertime. They get resins from trees, and they use that to seal up holes in the hive and to glue various things together. And it is also thought to have significant antibiotic properties. So anyway, you crack it open. You use your hive tool to gently wedge apart a frame from another frame and lift it up. There's another tool you can get if you really don't want to put your hands directly on a frame. There is like a double plier device called a frame lifter that you can use to grab the top of the frame and pull it out to inspect the bees. And what you're going to be looking for on this first inspection, you want to make sure there's brood. You want to look over and make sure there aren't any parasites crawling all over the place, which is a terrible thing, but it happens. And then you don't have to find the queen. If you find evidence that the queen was there recently and healthy, you're usually pretty good. You're pretty well off at that point. Here's a better view of the frame here. You can see a very, what we would call a nice brood pattern. The queen has filled up that frame really well. And there's a little bit of open honey up in the corners. And if you look in those open spots, that queen has gone back through there, and she has dropped eggs in there, and they're raising larvae in every possible spot they can. That's a sign of a healthy colony right there. On close inspection, now this is a cutaway here. This is not, the frames aren't, the comb isn't that shallow. This is cut away for making it easier to view. What you'll see on the bottom and right side of this, those are eggs. And if you don't have good eyesight, like me, you take a magnifying glass out there. I keep one in my pocket of my suit, and I can look right down into that comb, and I can see eggs and very small larvae that way. As the larvae grow, they'll look more like what you see on the left. Once they get big enough, they've eaten up all their supplies in there, the worker bees will cap over that cell, and the larva will pupate and will emerge, depending on what kind of, whether it's a worker, a drone, or a queen, will emerge a couple of weeks to 3 weeks later. Sorry, the entire life cycle is a couple of weeks to 3 weeks, from egg to emergence as young adult. So over the course of the spring, depending on the strength of your colony that you've gotten, you're going to see growth happen. And this is an important part of keeping your bees, is watching the colony's growth and health and being able to provide more boxes or take boxes away or change things out. This is another reason we recommend getting at least 2 colonies to begin with, is if one of them is weak and not thriving, you can literally take, as long as you don't take the queen, you can literally take a frame of bees and larvae and swap them out and put them in the other colony. And that will help boost up their population. And if, for example, something really bad happens and you lose your queen in one colony, you can actually get to a point where you know how to pick a frame out of another colony and put it in there, and they will make a new queen themselves. It is part of the natural cycle of what they do when they're queenless. They can make a queen from a young larva. As each box fills up, if you start with one deep, you're going to have more equipment available and put a second deep on, unless you're going to be, some people in Georgia like to run with a single deep. I run double deep 8-frame, which is what you see here, except for that nuke in the middle. Double deep 8-frame suits me. You're going to probably, if you go to a bee club, you're going to get as many different opinions as there are beekeepers in just the right way to do it. But that's what works for me. What you see here, let's start on the far left here. This is a good strong colony. It's a double deep 8, thriving, plenty of bees coming and going. And then on top of that is a honey super. The next one over with the butterfly on the front is doing even better. They've already filled one of the honey supers, and so on an inspection, I came back and saw that and said, okay, all right, they need more. All right, I'm going to go ahead and put a second super on top of there. The other one, the nuke there, it's just coming along. The little gap that you see there between the nuke box and the lid, that's a different style of feeder that sits on top. We'll talk about feeders later. The next one over, Star, is not doing as well, unfortunately. Then the one after that is doing quite well, and again, back to not doing as well. Size the space for the bees. It is important that they have enough room, but not too much room, and we'll talk about why in a minute. And why have all these different markings on the front of them, the different things? The bees will actually identify their home by sight. And what you'll see is when a new bee comes out to become a foraging bee, the older bees are foragers, when they do that, the first thing they're going to do is they're going to fly out and they're going to turn around and they're going to fly kind of dancing back and forth in front of their hive and look at it. They're going to learn what it looks like. Now they're going to easily make it back to this whole apiary, bee yard, but picking the individual colony that they came from is made easier if each one has a specific color and shape identifying it. It's actually more the shape than the color. And what that means is that the bee is more likely to go back into the box it belongs in. It's not absolutely critical. It's when they go in the wrong one, it's called drifting. It's not at all critical unless it's the queen. If the queen goes in the wrong box, she can be killed by the other bees. She can be killed by the queen in that box. And in addition to that, the queen coming where she was supposed to go back then goes queenless, and that's trouble.
So Dan, a question, I'm sorry.
No,
we had a question that was sort of, I should have jumped on it a minute ago, but related to sort of growth and how quickly growth happens in a hive. How many, I'm assuming it's probably environmentally related, but about how many larvae are produced in a hive per year? And do they do it all in one season, or are they constantly producing new larvae?
That's a really good question. The queen can produce between 1,000 and 2,000 eggs a day. I know, it's a lot. In the springtime, as it builds up, she'll start off with very little in the dead of winter, but then after Christmas, when the days start to get a little bit longer, and especially on warmer days and when the maple trees start to bloom and a little bit of pollen comes in, that triggers the colony to get ready to raise brood. And so the queen will start laying more and more and more. And some years she doesn't stop at all in the winter, depending on where in Georgia you are. And then in full tilt in April, she's producing maybe around 1,500 a day. So you also have to think from about that peak period on, before and after that range, 1,500 bees are dying every day as well. And they die by literally working themselves to death, or they fall prey to a lot of different things, birds and dragonflies. And I had a fence lizard that was camped out right in front of some of my hives. And boy, was she a fat girl. She had been eating bees the whole darn time. I chased her off into the woods nearby, where I knew there was a big old snake. Hopefully that snake got her. So yeah, they're raising the young all throughout the season, but it's like a bell curve that peaks in April, May, and then tapers off again through the summer. There's a little bit of a re-wave of increased brood that's happening right about now. Goldenrod is blooming, so the bees are sensitive to the season and the region. So down in Florida, they have a tendency to kick all year long, versus up, say, in the Blue Ridge Mountains, there will be a much longer period in the dead of winter when they're not producing any at all. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
All right, so where were we? We're covering drifting, size, yeah, expanding and contracting the colony. And we will get to harvest here in a bit too. So another thing that's really important to know is that when your bees are growing in the springtime, it is also exactly the same time that they want to reproduce. Now you might think of the queen laying an egg as a form of reproduction, and it sort of is, but you have to think of the colony as what we call a superorganism. And the reproduction cycle is actually when the bees swarm. And a bee swarm is where the workers, which by the way, the workers are the ones making all the decisions. The queen is basically an egg factory. So the workers decide together, there's good nectar coming in, we're at peak season here, we've got a good population going on. Oftentimes we feel kind of crowded in our home, and they decide they're going to drive that queen out, and they're gonna take about half of the population of the colony, and they're gonna go out with the queen, and they're gonna find a new home. Now, the thing that they do before that, when they're getting ready for that, is they start to make new queens. I'm not going to go into the details of how they do it. It's a special diet, but they create new queen cells, and they'll make up to a dozen of them in a colony, more or less. A good strong colony can make a lot of them, but it's somewhere around there, maybe 6. And right when those queen cells that are back in the colony are ready, the half of the colony will leave with the queen. And they will go out, and the first thing you're going to see is this giant bee-nado outside. And you're going to think, what is going on here? And it makes a kind of a dull roar sound as well. So if you're around in swarm season, you can listen to this. And then what they're going to do is they're going to coalesce. Hopefully not 40 feet up an oak tree, because a swarm is actually valuable. And this is also a video. I'm going to see if it'll play for you. I hope this works. I'm talking a little bit about what's going on here. What happens now is that these bees are going to have to find a new home. And they do this through a democratic process of going out. The ones that were foragers become scouts, and they're going to look for a new home. And then they're going to come back and report it to the colony. And let's see what I said. I can't remember exactly what I said in this video, and I hope it plays well for you.
They are telling each other, I found a spot. I think you're going to like it. And you should go look for it. And when enough of them decide that, they will all leave all of a sudden. And it's coming soon. There's a lot of dancing going on. So I've got to collect this pretty quickly.
Okay, so that was me talking about what they do. They do a little dance called a waggle dance that they also use to tell each other where to find good flowers. The waggle dance tells these bees where to look for the new home. And this can happen as quickly as 15 minutes or as long as a few days. So when you get a swarm that has coalesced outside of your bee yard somewhere, again, hopefully on a branch 4 feet high to make your life easy, you will be able to gather these. And this is a package of bees hanging off a branch like ripe fruit ready for you. And they're really fairly easy to catch. They're surprisingly docile. You can literally put your hand on them, and I even know somebody who pushes it gently through a swarm just to show off. And they're fairly easy to catch. I recommend asking somebody who's done it before to help you with your first one. But once you do this, It's an easy harvest and a great way to easily increase the size of your bee yard. Here's a new bee yard here that this is a good example of showing you the difference to avoid drift here. And remember, I had the different colored ones on that other bee yard. It's actually shape that makes a really big difference for them. These markings here are clearly high contrast and delineated. There's very little drift in this bee yard as a result. But my point was that you can increase your number of bees fairly quickly by catching swarms. You can also just catch other swarms. You don't have to catch your own bees. So beekeeping isn't all shiny light and happiness. There are a lot of troubles with bees. There are challenges to beekeeping, to keeping your bees alive and healthy and producing for you. The two big ones in the Piedmont of North Georgia are starvation and a parasite called varroa mites. Hive beetles are secondary but important. And then I say bears, etc., because there are some animal pests that can be a bother. Other insects that prey on honeybees, badgers. You can get mice in a colony, any number of little odds and ends. But I'm going to talk mostly about the top two: starvation and varroa mites. In Georgia, we have a very short nectar flow. And the honeybees have to make all they can in a very short period of time. It's really 6 to 8 weeks in the spring. There's a little bit happening right now with the goldenrod that's blooming right now, but it's not a significant amount. And there are often times when your bees will run through all of their honey supplies and will literally starve. There is a midsummer starvation that can happen. If you take too much of their honey, if you harvest too much or they weren't a strong colony in spring, you may need to feed them in July and August, waiting for the fall flow. And if it's a drought year, you might not get any fall flow at all. In the same point, in the dead of winter, if they've been eating through that honey to keep themselves warm, the honeybees keep themselves warm by vibrating their wing muscles even when they're not flying, and they keep the colony warm and cohesive that way. And so they must consume honey for the energy needed to generate that heat. So starvation can happen very readily. The biggest time that this happens, typically in our part of the state, our part of the country, is in February. The colony begins to build up again, and they start going through much more honey than they would otherwise, because they're not only keeping themselves warm, but they're keeping the colony warmer, and they are feeding all those larvae. So how do we feed our bees? Up on the top left is what's called an entrance feeder, and that you just shove right in the entrance of a Langstroth hive, and you use a mason jar with holes perforated on it, and you mix up sugar and water. So a lot of people just go with regular old 1 pint of water to 1 pound of sugar, and that usually works just fine for most people. And that is a very simple way, an easy way to do that. The caveat to that is that if you use an entrance feeder in the summertime, you can set your hive up for being robbed by other bees. And we can talk about that in questions and answers later if you'd like. It's a complicated answer. In the top right picture, this is what's called a top feeder. I believe it's often called a Nelson feeder. And basically what it is it's a waterproof trough, basically a big square bucket. And then on the top part of it there, you can see is screened and has little gaps. The bees crawl up and then crawl down that screen to where the level of the sugar water gets through there, and they drink that. That is a very high capacity. That's probably 2 gallons right there. And if you really want to do a lot of feeding, that's a really viable way to do it. The one on the bottom, this is called a pro feeder. And it actually takes, this one is 1.5 gallons, and it takes the place of 2 frames in your hive itself. So as an example of use, let's say you're running double deep 8-frame colonies, and up in the top they're not completely full. In fact, you really want to feed them a good bit more. You'll take 2 empty frames out of the top that aren't being used and put this in place. And the bees will find it readily. And when they need any of that sugar water, when there's no nectar flow and they need sugar, they will go ahead and drink that right down. They will place that in the frames with a drawn comb, and they will treat it as if it were something they were turning into honey. Now, you have to be careful when you're feeding that you don't do this during the nectar flow. They'll typically take less of it anyway, but you don't want to mix this with the true nectar. You don't want to be making sugar water honey. It's not real, and if you're going to be selling it, it's unethical. Those are the ways to feed. And typically speaking, 1-to-1 is the ratio a lot of people use. Some folks like to go 2-to-1 at different times of the year, but it's been proven not necessary. You can do something called open feeding as well, where you just leave a trough about 50 feet away from your colonies. I don't want to go into that. There's some benefits to it and complications of it. This is the big bad wolf. This is a colony parasite, an individual bee parasite called varroa mites, or the binomial is Varroa destructor, and it is very destructive. It leapt over from a different species of honeybee to the species that we use, and has been devastating. When it first made it to the United States in the late 80s, it devastated the beekeeping industry and backyard beekeeping, and basically wiped out all the feral colonies for a while, all over the country. And it is in almost all parts of the world now. Luckily, we've learned some strategies for how to take care of it. It is really, really bad for the colony. Most colonies will die out if they're not treated for varroa mite infestation, and all colonies will get varroa mites. It's that good of a parasite that it finds its way into every colony eventually. So what this parasite does is it gets down in the brood, and it feeds on the brood while it's forming. And not only does it sap some of the energy of the brood, but it also transmits a wide range of viruses, and has been shown to make them worse as well. The viruses become what's called more virulent. This is, like I said, this is the big bad wolf. The treatment options, the very first treatments that were used were miticides, and they were effective for a little while. Folks have gotten away from many of those. There's some that are still used today. I'm not going to cover everything, but I will say recently it became legal to use oxalic acid. And I know that sounds a little bit crazy, but oxalic acid occurs naturally in the colony in low levels anyway, and in foods like rhubarb and strawberry already. So you're not putting a hard chemical in when you're using oxalic acid. That and formic acid are both very efficacious, and they are actually both approved for use by Certified Naturally Grown, which is a sort of like an organic certification. I'm not going to go into the methods of how to apply it, except to say there's a device or various devices that will vaporize it into the colony, and then you can also do what's called the dribble, which is where you see in the bottom right with that syringe, where you apply a specific quantity of this in a liquid solution into the colony. My preference, and I like it a lot, it works very well and doesn't hurt the bees, is to use vaporization. I have seen the liquid done. I worry about putting water in a colony. Too much water in a colony at the wrong time of year is a bad idea. This is small hive beetle, and this is a colony parasite that came to us courtesy of South Africa, and it's not a primary destroyer of a colony per se, and you are likely to get it. It flies in. It can smell a colony from far away. You can get even just 1 or 2 in an otherwise very clean nuke. They typically won't get them in packages, but you can. Either way, this is something that you have to watch out for. This year, 2020, was particularly bad for small hive beetle. I think it was a combination of the warm winter and the wet spring that we had. And what they'll do is they'll get in and somehow or another, they're able to either smell like, feel like, or look like the honeybees enough to a honeybee that they are often tolerated at low levels. A strong colony will typically corral them into corners, but will actually often feed the adults, but leave them caught in the corner. They can even close them off and entomb them into parts of the hive. But if the colony is weakened, say by example, if you have a high varroa population and a lot of viruses in your colony, the bees are not going to be as strong, and they're not going to fend off the beetles, which will lay their eggs all over. And the larvae, well, that's that picture in the bottom right. It just makes me cringe. The larvae will very quickly go through all of the colony and just make a horrible, disgusting, rotten mess of the thing. They're terrible. After that, we need a pretty picture. The answer for small hive beetles is there are various trapping devices and strategies that people employ, but the very best strategy for hive beetle is to keep your colony strong. If you have a good, strong colony, it's going to do well against them. Also, typically speaking, it's recommended to try to keep your colony in full sun. And for some reason, the hive beetles don't thrive as much. There's some thoughts that they don't like the heat that's generated by that. Another thought is that the ground dries out around the colony more. The hive beetle life cycle includes dropping out of the hive and into the ground where the hive beetle pupates. So if that ground is very dry, it's not going to be as successful at pupating. One of the strategies I really like for hive beetle that works very well is to employ beneficial nematodes. They are small microscopic worm-like creatures that you simply sprinkle into the ground around the colony. They don't harm anything else, but they will parasitize and destroy and reproduce inside the larvae of the small hive beetle. There are particular beneficial nematodes for lots of different organic gardening processes. There's one in particular that's the best for hive beetle. If anybody wants to know, I'll give that at the end. So if you've done everything well, you've got a good, strong colony, probably not your first year, but your second year, you're going to have a harvest. And this is my buddy Basil, the guy who's been beekeeping for 30 years. He does not take an entire box off. He harvests one frame at a time, even if he's working with Langstroths. There's Sophia, again, there on the left, helping out. I will say this. In your first year beekeeping, you deserve a harvest no matter what. Even if it is just one spoonful of honey out of the corner, you deserve it. You've put in a lot of time and effort and put out a lot of cash. At least have yourself a taste of the honey. Now, if you've got a really strong colony and you've been building up and you've got supers absolutely full, by all means, take some honey. Leave plenty behind for the bees. What I leave behind is what they make in the double deep 8s. I don't need to leave supers. If you're running, for example, a single box, a 10-frame box, in our part of the state, it's recommended to leave a 10-frame medium full of honey for them for the winter.
Dan, I think that was sort of answering a question on that, but is there sort of a ratio rule of thumb for folks, depending on what size they have or what style of beehive they have, as to how much you should leave?
It's typically in the range of 30 pounds of honey that you want to leave behind in our part of the state. If you're up further north, you probably want to leave a little more. And that really does vary. Some bees, there are actually different races of bee, and some of them are better at shutting down and not producing brood when there isn't a nectar flow. The Italians are known as being very gentle bees, but they're also known for going through a whole lot of honey in the spring buildup. So you may need to leave them a little bit more. The other side of that is if you don't leave them enough, or sometimes even if you do, they're going to run through all that and you're going to have to feed them anyway. I have a friend who's a very competent beekeeper. He takes lots and lots of honey off and says, you know what? They're going to eat it all anyway. I'm going to feed them back sugar, and it's a whole lot cheaper. I can make a lot of money off of my honey, and sugar is actually a lot cheaper for me, so I'm going to feed them back sugar. There are a lot of folks who don't like that. They think that that's it's like feeding them potato chips versus green vegetables, but honey is primarily a carbohydrate source. There are some minerals in it, some other odds and ends, some bits of pollen are in the honey, but it is primarily carbohydrate, and so he's not wrong in that if he feeds sugar, it has the same effect. They're getting most of their actual nutrition from the pollen, not from the honey itself. So typically speaking, most folks around here will harvest sometime in June because the nectar flow ends usually early in June, sometimes late in May, and you can go ahead and harvest at that point. Some people leave them on for longer, and you can do that. It's typically speaking, if the colony is large enough, they can guard all of that. They can keep it safe and clean from other insects coming in like ants and the hive beetles and all that. But if you take it off and harvest it and put it in jars, then you know it's safe. You want to harvest your honey when the majority, like 95% of the cells are capped. And this is what that looks like. It's similar to brood in look, but not quite the same. Those are capped honey cells right there. The reason you want to wait until it's capped is because the moisture content has to be low enough that it won't ferment in the jar. You can literally explode jars of wet honey. The magic number is 18.6% water content in the honey. I like to shoot for 17.5 myself. The reason you need it below 18.6 is to stop fermentation, but the lower it gets, the more concentrated the flavors are in the honey. Now, do you need to know all those percentages? Typically not. Typically, if your comb is covered, if it's capped off like this, you're going to be fine, especially if you're not storing the honey for a very long period of time. If that fermentation begins, it's going to start slowly unless you're working with very wet honey. You can go with the capped method, or you can actually get a piece of equipment called a refractometer that is going to put a sample of honey on a little glass part of it and look through the scope on it, and it will tell you what percentage sugar, water content is in your honey. Now, the actual harvest here, this is Sage, a friend of my son's, using what's called a capping knife, and he's cutting the cappings off of a frame of honey. And this is the fun part, and kids love doing this, at least for the first 15 minutes until it's just hard work and a sticky mess. But you can get some kids going on it for quite a while. And that's what the uncapped looks like. And you can, there on the left again is uncapped honey, and you've got all those wax cappings in the bottom there, and that's what you're going to use. You can do what's called rendering that wax and clean it up. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then on the right here, this is an extractor, which is basically just a big old salad spinner for specifically built for frames. This is not absolutely necessary for extracting your honey. This is a big piece of equipment. It costs a good bit of money, and you're only going to use it once or twice a year. If you have a small backyard, couple of hives, you can do what's called crush and strain. And that's where you basically scrape off the honey off the frames and put it in a strainer. You can use a sieve or any kind of strainer or cheesecloth or things like that over a bucket, and the majority of that honey is going to drip through over the course of about 24 hours. So you don't really have to have a whole lot of equipment to harvest. And you can get very complex with harvest equipment, but it's just not necessary. And then bottle it up. These great little honey badger jars came to me from a company that was making barbecue sauce down in Texas, and they're terrific. You can choose glass jars. Plastic is okay as long as it's a food grade. I don't recommend reusing any jar that had anything like pickles in it, for example. But a peanut butter jar is usually fine. Obviously, honey jars you can save up. Most salad dressing and just canning jars are fine too. They really are. If you're going to sell your honey, legally speaking, you are supposed to sell it by weight, not by volume. But you'll see plenty of people selling pints and quarts, and the honey police are not getting them. Speaking of selling, if you are allowed without any permit in the state of Georgia, without any licensing or inspection, to sell your honey directly to any consumer you want. That is off your front porch, that is by internet, any way you want to do it. As long as it's going to the end consumer, there are no regulations involved in selling your honey at retail. If you're going to sell it to a store who will then sell it to the end consumer, there are some complications involved in that. I'll answer that as a question if anybody has that at the end. And wax, as I said, when you scrape those cappings off, or if you do crush and strain, you're going to get a lot of wax. There's a process we call rendering, where you melt down and clean the wax. You melt it at a low temperature so you don't burn it, and you pass it through cheesecloth one or several times to clean it up. And I love wax for making all kinds of things. Like I said, I make lip balm every year. At various times, I have made candles. And again, you melt the wax at just the right temperature. You don't want to go too hot. About 145 degrees Fahrenheit, I think, is ideal. And cast it into molds. Making candles is a lot of fun. It's another product you can sell, or makes a fine gift. I enjoy it a lot. You can go through a lot of wax pretty quickly, though, so make sure you have enough to start. Oh, in the top left there, that's just one of those little mini cookers with a valve drilled into the side of it. You can make that yourself. I believe there are a few people selling those. Now, what I haven't talked about really is the whole rest of the season. I've gone up to harvest time in June. I'm going to cover the rest of the season briefly. It's tempting, you've done a whole lot of work all spring long. You've caught swarms, you've been watching after your bees and everything, and then you harvest all this honey. You think, oh, great, I'm done for the year. But actually, July is when you begin the next season by assuring that your bees are healthy and strong, and going into the fall and winter with enough stores and with enough healthy bees to make it through the winter and start strong the next year. Typically speaking, in midsummer, we have a dearth, a lack of nectar flow. And what we need to watch out for at that time is that the colony doesn't starve, that a stronger colony nearby in your yard or another yard doesn't come in and rob out your hive. It can happen where a colony will just decide, all right, this colony is weak enough, we're going to go in here and we're just going to take all of their honey. And it's a pretty horrendous scene to watch. There's fighting at the entrance and all up and around, lots of bees dying, and it can wipe out your colony. And that is a tough thing. Another thing that happens, it's really important to note, is that in the dearth, the population of your honeybees is going to decline naturally. It's a normal part of the process. Unfortunately, at that same time, the population of varroa mites, remember the big bad wolf, will be increasing and can become a significant problem in your colony at that time. Typically speaking, we like to treat for varroa in midsummer, if possible, as well as the dead of winter. I like to treat right before Christmas, at the very shortest day of the year, as long as the weather is right for it. And I treat in the summertime as well. Twice a year is often good enough for us. How many times and what you use is going to be your choice. There are a lot of choices available, and I can address that at the end if anybody asks.
So Dan, are you saying it's more of a treatment regimen? It's not necessarily based on scouting during the year?
Yeah, you know, I'm in horticulture, and integrated pest management and scouting and all of that are very important to what we do. Uh, Honestly, straight from the experts, they say no matter what, you're going to have them. No matter what, you should treat.
Sure.
Um, that said, uh, there are methods for scouting. We use what's called an alcohol wash, where you take a sampling of a few hundred bees, and you sacrifice the bees in the process. But again, remember, 1,000 bees born every day, 1,000 bees dying every day. A few hundred bees once in the summer isn't really a significant problem for them, as long as you don't get the queen. So you sacrifice these bees in an alcohol wash and you shake them, and the mites fall off, and you count the number of mites. And there is a threshold um, of the number of mites that are tolerable, a 3% threshold, uh, that is the treatment threshold. But honestly, I strongly suggest that you consider just treating in this case. And this comes literally straight from the horse's mouth of experts in beekeeping, that it's a good idea. Now, that said, I have some friends who are staunch advocates of treatment-free beekeeping. And I have one of them, actually, she's the president of the state association right now. And she has never treated her bees, and it works for her. Will that work for everybody? Very few people. She's in a special situation where she is, and it works for her. I can't recommend it at all. I know too many people who started off that way and got wiped out over and over again.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
In terms of, and with oxalic acid, it sounds like there may not be, but for different treatments, whether it's for mites or whatever it may be, do most of those things have some sort of pre-harvest interval restriction? Like, do you have to worry about honey harvesting with any of the medications that are out there?
Absolutely, yes. More so with the hard chemicals. There's one hard chemical right now called Apivar that is still effective. Most of the other ones are considered are not as effective anymore because, as you probably know, if you use the same chemical over and over and over again, you get resistance buildup in the pest, and they're just no good against varroa mites anymore. Apivar is still efficacious, and you are not to use it with honey supers on at all. So you would want to, in this case, you would use it in the middle of the summer after you have harvested all of your honey. You can put Apivar in. It's a little bit pricey. It is highly effective. It really does work. I don't like to use it. I use it in observation hives because they're hard to treat otherwise, and you're never harvesting out of an observation hive. I'm a staunch advocate of oxalic acid. It works. They've been using it in Europe for decades now, and there is no sign of resistance building up yet, which is pretty cool, considering it's nearly organic.
Yeah.
So if you become a successful beekeeper, I have to warn you, it can be a little bit addictive, because once you learn how to grow your own bees and catch your own swarms and maybe figure out how to make less expensive equipment yourself, or a good source for cheap wood, you're going to find oftentimes you want to expand. And next thing you know, you're going to be hauling your bees up to the mountains to get sourwood honey, which is what this is here. This is something, you can see 3 different styles of hives here. This is something I do with 2 buddies. And if you look closely, you'll see a little gray run of gray wires in front. I spoke about bears earlier. Up in the mountains, there are bears. And so shortly after the June harvest, we'll put our supers back on and run colonies on my trailer up to the mountains. This is just outside of Young Harris, Georgia here. And we'll set up a solar fence charger and put up an electric fence to keep the bears out of our colonies, and just put it up around the trailer. And we leave it up there for a few weeks around July, and collect absolutely delicious sourwood honey. To me, there's nothing like it. It's a lot of work moving bees, but it's completely delicious. You may also find you like the idea of providing pollination service. Pollination is a huge industry in the United States. Just the almond industry alone employs somewhere close to 750,000 colonies of honeybees. And each colony, I believe, is now getting close to $200 just for the beekeeper to park that colony in the almond orchard for a few weeks in late winter. There is local pollination service available as well, but it's not nearly as significant as the almonds.
So we had a related question that sort of ties into the sourwood comment. How are you able to say that honey is from a particular nectar source? Is it a matter of just location and time of the year? Do you have to, how can you sort of verify it's this kind of honey versus that kind of honey?
Absolutely correct. And there's pretty much never 100% anything. I mean, you would have to be in 10,000 acre monoculture in order to do that. So when we call something a varietal honey, it's because we've put our bees somewhere when the nectar flow for that variety is significantly predominant. Now, up in the mountains, you're going to get sumac right on one end of the sourwood, and you'll get a little bit of that in there all the time. But the less of that, if you get your timing right and your location right, you can have vast majority sourwood, and it has a really completely delicious, distinctive flavor, and you know when you got it. But yeah, it's absolutely true that you can't say for sure I have all blackberry honey or all tulip poplar honey. You can count on some of the characteristics and say this is heavy on tulip poplar. And if you're in the middle of a blueberry farm with hundreds of acres, you can be fairly certain you've got blueberry honey. Some of the other varietals like Tupelo and Orange Blossom, again, those beekeepers know that the vast majority of flowers in bloom that are attracting the bees at that time are that particular type of flower that they're going to make that particular varietal of honey.
Gotcha. Thanks.
So in conclusion, I got to say, I love beekeeping. I think it's a great thing that all people should try. And it has, again, that really unique characteristic as a hobby of literally being able to pay for itself. Just very easily and readily sell honey and other hive products right off your front porch. Typically speaking, this happens by word of mouth, but you can certainly market your honey. You can do flea markets, and I participate in the big city bred holiday market and sell quite a lot of my harvest through them, and that works out pretty well. It's a lot of fun. I find it challenging, but I enjoy it, and I think you would too. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dan. That was awesome. We got to a lot of our questions. We do have a few more. So if anybody has a question that didn't quite get answered, or if you just want to stick around, ask a couple more questions, or listen into some of the discussion for a few more minutes, feel free. So I had a question back sort of towards the middle, which was a good question of how do you know when it's the right time to add a super to your hive?
You want to watch for how they're building up. If you've got, say for example, an 8-frame, and you've put a nuke in the center, for example, in the center 5, and they've started to build out on those outer frames. You want to add another box on top of that at that time. If they're not really building, you've got a little bit of time. You don't want to throw a big empty box up there because they don't need it and they won't be able to defend it properly. And if you go over the winter like that, it's a big open cavity to try to keep warm that is unnecessary.
Okay. Yeah. So you're just sort of keeping an eye on how much space they're taking up in their main frame.
Sure. A weekly check in the spring is a good idea.
Okay. Sort of related to the nectar source, what sort of an average comfortable distance for bees to be able to get nectar sources from the hive?
Well, bees will fly, they say, up to 3 miles to get nectar, but there's a diminishing return because they're using energy when they fly. And so really, typically speaking, if they're doing most of their foraging as close as they can, but as long as it's a significant source, but a half mile easily, a mile if necessary. So if you've got a little 1 acre garden patch, don't feel like you can't keep half a dozen hives there, because they're going to be heading way out into all of your neighbors and the forests nearby and the meadows and whatnot. It's not just your property that's going to supply them with their nectar.
Okay, and would that be the same for a water source? And then what sort of qualifies as a water source for bees? Can it be something as small as like bird baths or fountains nearby, or does it need to be a stream or a lake?
Any water source at all. My primary water source right here is a pond that is probably 4 feet by 2 feet. And I add water to it pretty regularly, and it's got a little fountain that splashes up on the stones. And they like to sip that water from moist rocks. You have to be careful how you set up their water, because they can actually drown fairly easily. If you're going to put a bird bath out, try to put rocks in it for them to land on, so they're not having to go on that steep side of the bath, the little tub of it, in order to get to the water. A lot of people like to use chicken feeders with pebbles in there. That's a good source. Another really great use for that entrance feeder that we saw earlier is just to put water in there instead of sugar syrup, and their water is right there for them. A lot of times, honeybees will bother your neighbor's swimming pool. They really seem to like that chlorine in the water, the salt levels and whatnot, and the chlorides. They really like that a lot. And a really great strategy for keeping them from going there is to provide a better water source closer, because bees are about that efficiency thing. They won't fly further than they have to get what they need, but they definitely need plenty of water, especially in the summer. And the entrance feeder just fits that bill beautifully. The entrance feeder used as a feeder can start robbing happening in the summertime, because the robbing bees can smell it and see it. But if it's for water, it won't set up robbing at all. And it's right there for them to use.
Yeah, that's great to know. We had a question back at the beginning when you mentioned the zones that you know of in Athens that do permit, in terms of code and zoning, raising bees. Do you have that in front of you as to what those zones are again?
Yeah. This is AR, CR, RS40, and RS25.
And if I'm correct, that's AR is agricultural, CR is commercial, and the RS are different residential zones with at least a certain amount of property.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. So I don't remember what the 25 and 40, I think it might be 1,000 square feet. But yeah, I've looked those up for different animal code enforcement, but it's something along those lines. So if you have a big enough residential property, or if it's zoned agricultural or apparently maybe commercial, then
Right. And I won't officially advocate it, but I know a lot of people who keep their bees on very small plots in town. And again, it's enforcement by complaint. So
right. So if you're upsetting someone, they have the right to ask you to move them, essentially.
yeah, or they can call code enforcement if they want to.
Yeah. We had a question about compatibility with butterflies and raising bees. Is there any sort of competition or any issue with having sort of a butterfly designated garden and introducing bees to that area?
Oh, that's a really good question. They can coexist just fine. Typically speaking, butterflies are going to be they're going to be visiting flowers with much longer corolla tubes. And the honeybees can't actually reach down in there, but the butterflies can very readily, the same as hummingbirds. Now, I will say this, some of those hummingbird feeders that you hang off your porch, the honeybees can get into. And my understanding is that the newer ones are engineered so that the nectar is too far away for the honeybees, so you won't have that competition. But generally speaking, nature takes care of itself. And I will say this, there's been a fair amount of talk lately about honeybees outcompeting their native pollinators. And while it's true they do add a pressure, I can say that up until the varroa mites came in the 80s, honeybees coexisted with pollinators by the billions and trillions for hundreds of years in the United States. Um, it's my firm opinion that really what the problems are chemical usage and habitat loss that are hurting our native pollinators.
Yeah, that's a good point. We had two related questions sort of related to sanitation. And one of them, I'll go ahead and just give you both in case they tie into each other. One question was, should the brood box essentially be left alone, or is there any management of that in terms of cleaning or anything else? And then the other question is, what precautions would someone take if they were going to use a previously used hive boxes or frames?
Sure. Um, you're going to be getting into the brood box because you're going to be doing inspections on a regular basis. You're going to make sure your colony is healthy and strong. As far as cleaning, a healthy, strong colony is going to clean that up for you. They'll make it as clean as they need it to be. They take care of all of that for you. Now, they will add more and more propolis over time, and they will put comb where you don't necessarily want it. And you can scrape off that comb if you don't want it there. We call that burr comb. But it's really not necessary. You just need to be able to get in there on a regular basis and look around. And what you need to clean up is just what's slowing you down from getting to them to look at them. Buying used equipment, there's a lot of fear out there about buying used equipment. I can tell you the vast majority of problems that you can inherit with used equipment are not long-term significant issues or do not survive equipment being left idle, say in somebody's garage or shed. There is one, American foul brood. It's not from the United States or any part of America, but it's just named that because we isolated it. American foul brood is really bad for a colony and can survive apparently for decades in spore form. And so typically speaking, you'll have a lot of people say, oh, definitely always buy new equipment. But if you're buying a nuke, you're buying used equipment already. What I would suggest is that you buy from a reputable source, whether it's new or used equipment. And what is reputable?
Yeah. If you have somebody's willing to give you old hives, or you have a friend, or honestly, Craigslist, I know it's not reputable, but if you are able to find affordable equipment, is there a sanitation, something you could do, like dipping it in a % bleach solution or something that would help with those issues? Or not necessarily?
The surest way of dealing with that is to immediately throw away all the frames because they're pretty hard to clean up, and then take a propane torch and scorch the inside of the hive entirely. Scrape it down, get off everything you can, scrape it out, and then torch it off, and that will kill the spores of American foul brood. All the other miscellaneous things that you can get, there's another one called European foul brood it's seasonal and not that dangerous. Nosema, there's some fungal things like chalk brood. They're not really a big deal. I gotta be honest, the two biggies, the real things that are the most important to watch out for are varroa mites and starvation. If you got a handle on those, you're most likely going to be a successful beekeeper.
Okay. I hope I hit everybody's questions. I'll stick around for another couple minutes. If you have anything, or if you think of something later, feel free to email us and we'll get in touch with Dan and can get you those answers. Thanks again, Dan, and everyone for joining. Hope you enjoyed it. The next lecture that we're doing in October is going to be about soil amendments and healthy soils. If you or anybody you know gardens or is thinking about gardening or just wants to know about soil, please join us, and we will see you guys next month. And if you can take a few minutes, we'd love it if you'd fill out the evaluation. I think we'll be sending another follow-up email with that if you can't find your reminder email. maybe the topic you suggest will show up in next year's lineup. So thanks, guys, and have a good evening.
All right. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Dan. We'll talk soon.
All right. Take care. I'm going to sign off.
All right. See ya.